The conference hall of the Galactic diplomatic station stretched across nearly 2 kilometers of polished metallic flooring, its crystalline domed ceiling offering a panoramic view of the star-scattered void beyond. For 3 centuries, this hall had hosted the most crucial negotiations in known galactic history. Treaties that prevented wars, accords that established trade routes spanning dozens of sectors, and agreements that had quite literally shaped the political landscape of 4 spiral arms had been hammered out within these walls. On this particular day in late 2387, the hall buzzed with the familiar cacophony of interspecies diplomacy. The Zephyrian delegation chittered anxiously among themselves, their translucent wings fluttering in patterns that conveyed deep concern to anyone versed in their body language. The massive Krulon representatives sat motionless, their rock-like exteriors betraying nothing of their thoughts, while the ethereal collective's energy-based forms flickered and pulsed in what could only be described as agitation. At the center of it all, in the specially designed section reserved for carbon-based humanoid species, sat the human delegation. They appeared unremarkable compared to the exotic array of alien forms surrounding them. No wings, no energy manifestations, no crystalline appendages or adaptive camouflage. Just bipedal primates in simple dark suits, sitting quietly with their hands folded, watching the proceedings with those peculiar forward-facing eyes that had evolved for hunting. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, the lead human representative, maintained the same patient expression she had worn for the past 18 months of negotiations. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her brown eyes held the kind of steady calm that had made her species effective negotiators throughout their relatively brief membership in the Galactic Council. To her left sat Dr. Borrow, Marcus Chen, the human economic advisor whose mathematical models had been instrumental in several recent trade agreements. To her right was General Sarah Okafor, whose presence was more symbolic than practical. Humans rarely resorted to military solutions in diplomatic settings. The current crisis had begun 14 months earlier when the hegemony of Six had proposed new restrictions on faster-than-light travel through what they claimed were their ancestral territories. The problem was that these territories happened to include 17 of the most crucial hyperspace lanes in the galaxy, lanes that facilitated trade and communication between dozens of species. The proposed toll system would essentially allow the hegemony to control the economic lifeblood of half the known galaxy. The position of the hegemony remains unchanged, announced Overlord Vexahai, the primary representative of the Six. His species, the Dominari, resembled what ancient humans might have called demons. Tall, lean figures with elongated skulls, burning amber eyes, and skin that shifted between deep red and black depending on their emotional state. Currently, Vexhai's skin held a steady crimson that indicated supreme confidence. These lanes pass through space that has been ours for over 10,000 of your Earth years. We offer reasonable compensation to the Council for recognition of our sovereign rights. The reasonable compensation had been the sticking point for over a year. The hegemony wanted exclusive control over the lanes in exchange for allowing continued passage at rates that would cripple smaller species' economies. They had made minor concessions throughout the negotiations, reducing proposed toll rates by fractions of a percent, offering payment plans that would bind debtor species to hegemony interests for generations, suggesting alternative routes that would add months to journey times. Ambassador Vasquez had sat through every session, every revision, every heated debate. She had watched as the Zephyrians offered mineral rights to their 3 richest systems. She had observed the Krulon delegation propose sharing their defensive technologies. The ethereal collective had even offered to provide energy subsidies that would have solved the power needs of dozens of developing worlds. Each offer was met with polite consideration from the hegemony, followed by demands for more. Today marked month 18 of formal negotiations, though preliminary discussions had been ongoing for nearly 3 years. The pattern had become so familiar that many of the diplomatic staff could predict the daily schedule. Morning sessions where the hegemony would present their final position, afternoon debates where other species offered increasingly desperate alternatives, and evening recesses where small groups would huddle together trying to find some miraculous compromise. Perhaps, suggested Ambassador Takala of the Zephyrian Confederacy, her wings trembling with barely contained frustration, we might consider a joint management approach, shared oversight with rotating administrative periods. Vexhai's expression didn't change, but his skin darkened slightly toward black. The hegemony has considered this proposal in its 17 previous iterations. Our position remains that sovereign territory cannot be subject to foreign administration. However, we remain open to discussion regarding tributary arrangements for passage rights. The word tributary sent a ripple of agitation through the hall. Everyone understood what it meant. The hegemony wasn't just seeking control over the hyperspace lanes. They were positioning themselves as the dominant power in the galaxy, with every other species reduced to client states paying homage for the privilege of travel and trade. Chen leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had run countless economic projections. Overlord Vexhai, our analysis suggests that the proposed tributary system would result in a 17% reduction in intersystem trade within 5 years. For species like the Zephyrians who depend on rare mineral exports, this could mean economic collapse within a decade. Economic projections are speculative, Vexhai replied smoothly. The hegemony's management would ensure optimal efficiency. Temporary adjustments are inevitable during any transition period. General Okafor spoke for the first time that day, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the hall's acoustics. Temporary? For whom? Your projections show the hegemony's economic growth increasing by 300% over the same period. That doesn't sound like shared sacrifice. The Overlord's attention focused on the human general with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. General Okafor raises an interesting point. The hegemony has invested considerable resources in developing these trade routes over millennia. Should we not see returns on that investment? Your species, I believe, understands profit motives quite well. It was a calculated insult, referencing the stereotype that humans were obsessively focused on monetary gain. Ambassador Vasquez felt the familiar tightness in her shoulders that came with being patronized by a being whose species had been spacefaring since before humans had invented writing. She had dealt with such attitudes throughout her career. The assumption that humans, as one of the newest species to achieve interstellar travel, were somehow less sophisticated in their understanding of galactic politics. The hegemony's right to profit from their investments is not in question, Vasquez replied evenly. The issue is whether that profit should come at the cost of impoverishing half the galaxy. Surely there's a middle ground that serves everyone's interests. Middle ground, Vexhai repeated, as if tasting the words. An interesting concept. The hegemony has offered numerous compromises throughout these discussions. We've reduced our toll proposals, offered payment assistance, even suggested alternative development projects for affected species, yet each concession is met with demands for more. Perhaps the Council might consider what compromises they're prepared to make. Ambassador Takala's wings fluttered in what any Zephyrian could recognize as barely suppressed rage. Compromises? You've reduced toll rates from economically impossible to merely economically devastating. You've offered payment plans that would indenture our children's children to your banks. How exactly do you define compromise? The Krulon representative, Earthshaker Throm, spoke in the deep, resonant tones characteristic of his species. The position of the Krulon collective is clear. These lanes are essential infrastructure for galactic civilization. No single power should control them, regardless of historical claims. Historical claims. Vexhai's skin was now approaching pure black, indicating either anger or amusement. With the Dominari, the two emotions often looked identical. The Krulon collective speaks of historical claims while occupying 17 systems that once belonged to the Shi'Tar Empire. The Zephyrian Confederacy controls mining rights in sectors they claimed through conquest. Even the humans, his burning gaze fixed on Vasquez, have established colonies on worlds that were inhabited by pre-spaceflight civilizations. Does the Council wish to relitigate every territorial dispute in galactic history? The hall fell silent. It was a masterful rhetorical move, and everyone knew it. Vexhai had just reminded every species present that their current territories were built on some form of historical conquest or displacement. To challenge the hegemony's claims was to potentially open every border and every resource right to renegotiation. Ambassador Vasquez studied the Overlord's expression, noting the subtle satisfaction in his posture. This was what the hegemony did best. They found the moral compromises and historical contradictions that every civilization carried, then used them as leverage. It was effective precisely because it contained just enough truth to be uncomfortable. Overlord Vexhai raises valid points about historical precedent, she said finally. But we're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to find a path forward that doesn't destabilize the present. The hyperspace lanes aren't just trade routes. They're the communications backbone that holds this council together. If every message between systems has to be approved by hegemony sensors, if every supply ship has to pay tribute before carrying medical supplies to a plague-stricken world, then we're not talking about territorial rights anymore. We're talking about the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. Precisely, Vexai said, and his skin lightened slightly toward red again. The hegemony seeks to take responsibility for maintaining that structure. The current system is chaotic, inefficient, prone to disruption by minor conflicts and trade disputes. Under unified management, these lanes could operate at optimal capacity. Chen pulled up a holographic display showing trade flow patterns. Optimal for whom? Our models show that your optimal capacity scenarios involve shutting down traffic from 17 different species during peak trade periods. The efficiency gains you're describing come from prioritizing hegemony traffic over everyone else's. Economic modeling is an inexact science, the overlord replied dismissively. The hegemony's traffic naturally takes priority. We maintain the infrastructure. We bear the security costs. We ensure the lanes remain operational. Secondary users would naturally accept secondary priority. Secondary users, General Okafor repeated slowly. You're talking about every other species in the galaxy. I'm talking about practical realities. Vexay's voice carried the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to slow children. The hegemony has the resources and the will to properly manage these lanes. The Council has spent 3 years debating and accomplished nothing. Perhaps it's time to acknowledge which approach actually produces results. Ambassador Takala's translator struggled with the rapid clicking and whistling that followed, eventually producing, "The Zephyrian Confederacy categorically rejects any arrangement that reduces our people to second-class status in galactic commerce. We would rather find alternative routes than accept tributary status to the hegemony. Alternative routes that add 6 months to your mineral shipments," Vexai observed. Alternative routes that path through unpatrolled space where piracy rates exceed 40%. Alternative routes that would make your already marginal mining operations completely unprofitable. Yes, those alternatives exist. The question is whether your people are prepared for the consequences of choosing them. It wasn't quite a threat, but everyone in the hall understood the implications. The hegemony controlled enough military assets to make those alternative routes even more dangerous than they already were. Their historical claims to the hyperspace lanes were backed by the largest fleet in known space, and while direct military threats violated Council protocols, the implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Ambassador Vasquez felt a familiar weight settling on her shoulders. For 18 months she had sat in this chair, listening to variations of the same arguments, watching her fellow diplomats grow increasingly desperate as the hegemony's position remained unmovable. The humans had tried every negotiation strategy in their extensive playbook, building coalitions, finding creative alternatives, appealing to shared interests, even offering substantial concessions from their own trade agreements. Nothing had worked. The hegemony had a simple advantage. They wanted something more than everyone else wanted to give it up. They were willing to wait, to wear down opposition through sheer persistence, to make the alternative to agreement seem worse than agreement itself. It was a patient, methodical approach that had served them well in previous negotiations. What the hegemony hadn't quite understood was that patience had limits. The human delegation requests a 1-hour recess, Vasquez announced suddenly. Vexai's skin flickered with what might have been surprise. The Council was in the middle of reviewing revised proposals, and will continue that review after the recess. Vasquez stood smoothly. 1 hour. The Galactic Council's procedures allowed any delegation to call for brief recesses, though it was considered somewhat rude to interrupt ongoing discussions. As the human delegation filed out of the hall, Ambassador Vasquez caught glimpses of the confusion on her colleagues' faces. The humans had been remarkably consistent in their attendance and attention throughout the negotiations. This was the first time they had requested any kind of break outside the scheduled periods. In the smaller conference room reserved for delegation private discussions, General Okafor sealed the door and activated privacy screens that would prevent any form of electronic surveillance. Doctor, Chen pulled up secure communication links to Earth and the other human colonies. For several minutes, the three of them sat in silence. Well, Chen said finally, that was educational. Vasquez rubbed her temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache that had been building for months. 18 months of education. The hegemony isn't negotiating. They're just wearing us down until we give up. The pattern's been consistent, General Okafor observed. Every time someone proposes a compromise, they take the parts they like and reject the rest. Then they present the modified version as their generous offer and act like everyone else is being unreasonable for not accepting it immediately. Chen was running calculations on his portable display. his fingers moving rapidly across holographic interfaces. I've been modeling this for the past 6 months. The hegemony strategy is actually quite elegant from a game theory perspective. They've correctly identified that their position is stronger if these negotiations fail than if they succeed. If we can't reach an agreement, they'll simply implement their toll system unilaterally and dare anyone to challenge it militarily. And nobody will challenge it militarily, Vasquez said quietly. The Zephyrians don't have the fleet capacity. The Krulon are strong defensively, but they've never projected force beyond their own systems. The ethereal collective isn't even corporeal most of the time. The only species with the military capacity to challenge the hegemony directly are us, and we're not about to start an interstellar war over toll roads. General Okafor's expression was carefully neutral. We could challenge them militarily. Our force projection capabilities are actually superior to theirs in several key areas. But you're right, the political costs would be enormous. We'd be seen as the aggressors, the upstart species that solve diplomatic problems with violence. Exactly. Chen looked up from his calculations. The hegemony has maneuvered us into a position where all our options are bad. Accept their terms and we legitimize a system that will strangle half the galaxy economically. Reject their terms and watch them implement the system anyway. Fight them and become the villains of galactic history. Ambassador Vasquez stared out the small viewport at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there were the human colonies, worlds that had been settled by people willing to leave everything behind for the chance to build something better. The early colonists had faced impossible choices too: stay in overcrowded Earth cities or risk everything on the journey to uncertain worlds. They had chosen to take the risk, to accept hardship for the possibility of freedom. There is a fourth option, she said slowly. Chen and Okafor exchanged glances. What are you thinking? The general asked. We leave. The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Dr. Chen cleared his throat. Leave the negotiations? Leave the council. General Okafor leaned back in her chair, her dark eyes studying Vasquez intently. That would be unprecedented. No species has ever voluntarily withdrawn from the Galactic Council. Because no species has ever been in our position before, Vasquez replied. Every other member of the council needs those hyperspace lanes. Their entire economies depend on the current system. They're trapped. They have to find some way to accommodate the hegemony because the alternative is economic collapse. We're not trapped? Chen asked. Are we? Run the numbers, Marcus. How much of human trade actually uses those specific hyperspace lanes? Chen's fingers danced across his interface for several minutes. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful as data scrolled past. Interesting. About 30% of our intersystem commerce uses hegemony-controlled routes, but most of that could be rerouted through alternative lanes or... Wait. He paused, running additional calculations. Elena, if we withdrew from the council entirely, we'd no longer be bound by the Treaty of Uniform Standards, which means we could implement our own hyperspace navigation technologies without council approval. The quantum tunnel drives we developed last year, the ones the council banned as potentially destabilizing, those could reduce our travel times by 80% on routes that don't use traditional hyperspace lanes at all. General Okafor was nodding slowly. And militarily, withdrawal would free us from council restrictions on fleet movements and defensive preparations. We've been limiting our ship production to comply with council quotas, but if we're not council members anymore, we could defend our own systems without asking anyone's permission. Vasquez finished. The question is whether we're willing to accept the consequences. Withdrawal means giving up council protection, council trade agreements, council dispute resolution. We'd be on our own. We've been on our own before, Chen observed quietly. Humans spent most of our history without any kind of galactic support structure. We explored, we traded, we defended ourselves, we built civilizations. Other species needed the council because they'd never learned to be truly independent. We joined the council because it seemed like the civilized thing to do. But maybe civilization isn't always the right choice. Dr. Chen was still running calculations, his expression growing more excited as the implications became clear. Elena, this could actually work. If we withdraw and implement the quantum tunnel network, we could offer passage through human-controlled space to any species that wants to avoid hegemony tolls. Within 10 years, we could make their carefully controlled hyperspace lanes irrelevant. The hegemony wouldn't allow that, General Okafor pointed out. They'd try to stop us, probably through military action. Let them try. Vasquez's voice carried a hardness that surprised even her. The hegemony is used to fighting species that need council approval for every military decision. They've never faced an opponent that could respond immediately to threats without consulting committees and filing diplomatic protests. Chen was grinning now, his economic models showing probability curves that looked increasingly favorable. The beauty of it is that we don't need to defeat them militarily. We just need to demonstrate that their controlled routes aren't the only game in town. Once other species see viable alternatives, the hegemony's negotiating position collapses. It's a massive risk, General Okafor said, but her tone suggested she was warming to the idea. If we miscalculate, if the other species don't support us, if the quantum tunnel technology doesn't work as well as we hope, we could end up completely isolated. We're already isolated, Vasquez replied. We're sitting in that hall listening to the hegemony dictate terms to everyone while we pretend there's still room for negotiation. The only difference is that right now our isolation is voluntary and temporary. If we stay in the council, it becomes permanent. The three humans sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. Finally, Dr. Chen spoke up. There's something else to consider. The hegemony strategy only works if everyone believes they have no choice but to accept it. If even one major species demonstrates that viable alternatives exist, it changes the entire dynamic. We wouldn't just be saving ourselves, General Okafor mused. We'd be showing everyone else that they don't have to accept this either. Vasquez activated the secure communication link to Earth. The transmission delay to the home system was only a few seconds, but she knew that the conversation she was about to have would take much longer. Mr. President, we need to discuss our position in the ongoing negotiations. I think it's time to consider some unconventional options. The next hour passed quickly. By the time the recess ended, the human delegation had received preliminary authorization for a strategy that no one had seriously considered before. As they walked back into the main conference hall, Ambassador Vasquez felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had suddenly been lifted. The afternoon session proceeded much as the morning had. The hegemony presented their final offer, with minor modifications that addressed none of the fundamental concerns other species had raised. The Zephyrians offered additional concessions that would have bankrupted their mining operations within 5 years. The Krulons suggested security arrangements that would have given the hegemony military access to their most strategic systems. Overlord Vexhai listened to each proposal with the patient attention of someone who already knew he was going to reject everything. His skin maintained the confident crimson that indicated supreme satisfaction with his position. When the last proposal had been presented and rejected, he stood to address the assembly. The hegemony appreciates the creative efforts that various species have made to find alternative arrangements. He began, his tone managing to be simultaneously gracious and condescending. However, the fundamental reality remains unchanged. The hyperspace lanes are hegemony territory, and passage through them requires acknowledgement of hegemony sovereignty. We remain open to discussions regarding the specific terms of such acknowledgement, but the principle itself is non-negotiable. Ambassador Takala's wings were trembling with barely contained fury. Overlord Vexai, your non-negotiable principles would reduce the entire galaxy to tributary status. Surely even the hegemony can see that such an arrangement is unsustainable in the long term. Sustainability depends on cooperation, Vexai replied smoothly. The hegemony offers stability, security, and efficient resource management. Species that embrace these benefits will find the arrangement quite sustainable indeed. And species that don't embrace them, Earthshaker Throm's voice rumbled like distant thunder, will find alternative arrangements. The Overlord's skin darkened slightly. The galaxy is vast. There are many routes between the stars, some more convenient than others. The implied threat was clear enough that even the most diplomatic species in the whole couldn't ignore it. Accept hegemony terms or face economic isolation and potential military pressure. It was a masterful strategy because it put all the burden of choice on the victims. They could submit voluntarily or be forced to submit later, but submission was the only real option being offered. Ambassador Vasquez stood slowly, and something in her posture made the entire hall fall silent. For 18 months, the humans had been model participants in the negotiations. Patient, reasonable, always ready with alternative proposals and creative compromises. Now, as she prepared to speak, there was something different in her demeanor. something that made even Overlord Vexhai pause and pay attention. The human delegation has listened carefully to the hegemony's position. Throughout these negotiations, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustics. We've participated in good faith, offering numerous proposals and accepting various compromises in the interest of reaching a mutually beneficial agreement. Vexai's skin maintained its confident red, but his eyes had sharpened with interest. The hegemony acknowledges the constructive participation of the human delegation. We remain hopeful that Earth's influence might encourage other species toward more realistic positions. Vasquez smiled, and there was something in that expression that made several alien delegations shift nervously in their seats. It was the smile of someone who had just realized they were holding better cards than anyone suspected. The human delegation has indeed reached a more realistic position, she said. We've come to understand that these negotiations have served their purpose. They've clarified exactly where everyone stands, and they've demonstrated that the fundamental positions are irreconcilable. Irreconcilable positions are precisely why compromise becomes necessary, Vexhai observed, though his skin was beginning to show the first hints of darker coloration. Compromise requires that all parties have something to gain from agreement, Dr. Chen interjected, consulting his ever-present data displays. Our analysis suggests that the hegemony's optimal outcome is achieved through negotiation failure, not success. You benefit more from implementing your toll system unilaterally than from any agreement this council might reach. The Overlord's expression didn't change, but several other delegations were looking at the hegemony representatives with new understanding. It was an accusation that many had privately suspected, but none had been willing to voice publicly. The human delegation appears to be suggesting that the hegemony is negotiating in bad faith, Vexai said carefully. Not at all, General Okafor replied. We're suggesting that the hegemony is negotiating in perfect faith toward their actual objectives. The problem is that those objectives are fundamentally incompatible with galactic civilization as we know it. Ambassador Takala's wings fluttered in patterns that indicated deep confusion. If the human delegation believes the hegemony's position is unacceptable, surely that makes continued negotiation even more essential? Actually, Vasquez said, still wearing that enigmatic smile, it makes continued negotiation pointless, which is why the human delegation has decided to withdraw from these proceedings. The silence that followed was so complete that the hall's environmental system seemed unnaturally loud. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. Then Overlord Vexhai leaned forward slightly, his skin now showing definite hints of black. Withdraw from these proceedings? You mean leave the negotiations? I mean, leave the council. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half a dozen species began talking at once, their translators struggling to keep up with the rapid flow of questions, protests, and expressions of shock. Ambassador Takala's wings were beating so rapidly, they created visible air currents. Even the normally stoic Krulon delegates were showing signs of agitation. Through it all, the human delegation remained seated calmly, waiting for the uproar to subside. When order was finally restored, it was Overlord Vexhai who spoke first, his skin now approaching pure black. The human delegation cannot seriously be proposing to withdraw from the Galactic Council over a single trade dispute. This isn't a single trade dispute, Vasquez replied evenly. This is a fundamental question about how galactic civilization is going to function. The hegemony's position is that one species should control the infrastructure that everyone depends on, that economic and political power should be concentrated in the hands of whoever has the strongest historical claims. The Council's response has been to accept that premise and debate the specific terms of subjugation. Subjugation is an inflammatory term, Vexhai said, though his skin coloration suggested he wasn't entirely displeased with the characterization. It's an accurate term, Dr. Chen interjected. Tributary status, secondary user priority, payment plans that extend across generations. These are the terms of subjugation, not partnership. The hegemony isn't proposing to manage galactic infrastructure for everyone's benefit. You're proposing to control it for your own benefit and allow others to pay for the privilege of access. Ambassador Takala had finally recovered enough to speak coherently. But surely, if the human delegation disagrees with the current direction of negotiations, the appropriate response is to propose alternatives, not to abandon the process entirely. We've proposed alternatives, General Okafor reminded her. For 18 months we proposed alternatives. So has every other species in this hall. The hegemony has rejected every proposal that doesn't give them exactly what they want, because those proposals don't address the fundamental realities of the situation. Vexay's voice carried a note of frustrated patience. The hegemony maintains these lanes, defends them from pirates, ensures their operational efficiency. These responsibilities require resources and authority. Alternative proposals that ignore these realities are not serious contributions to the negotiation process. And there it is, Vasquez said quietly. The fundamental reality, according to the hegemony, is that you deserve to control galactic civilization because you're powerful enough to take control of galactic civilization. Every other consideration, fairness, mutual benefit, economic sustainability for smaller species, those are secondary to the fundamental reality of power. The Overlord's skin had stabilized at deep black, indicating either extreme anger or supreme confidence. With the Dominari, those emotional states often looked identical because they so frequently coincided. Ambassador Vasquez speaks of fairness and mutual benefit as if they were natural laws rather than convenient abstractions. The galaxy operates according to practical realities, not philosophical ideals. You're absolutely right, Vasquez agreed. And something in her tone made every delegation in the hall pay close attention. The galaxy does operate according to practical realities, which is why humanity is withdrawing from a council that no longer serves any practical purpose. The council serves many purposes, Earthshaker Thrum rumbled. Trade coordination, dispute resolution, mutual defense agreements, all of which become meaningless if the hegemony can unilaterally control access to the infrastructure that makes them possible. Chen interrupted. If every trade agreement can be overridden by toll decisions, if every dispute resolution can be influenced by economic pressure, if mutual defense requires permission from whoever controls the hyperspace lanes, then the Council is just an elaborate facade for hegemony dominance. Ambassador Takala's wings had stopped fluttering, settling into the rigid posture that indicated deep thought among her species. The human position is that Council membership has become incompatible with independence? Council membership has become incompatible with dignity, General Okafor said bluntly. We're sitting here debating how much tribute we're willing to pay for the privilege of conducting our own commerce. We're negotiating the terms of our own subjugation and calling it diplomacy. But what alternative do you propose? Takala asked. Humanity cannot simply exist in isolation from galactic civilization. We're not proposing isolation, Vasquez replied. We're proposing independence. There's a significant difference. Overlord Vexay had been listening to this exchange with growing apparent amusement, his skin lightening back toward red. The human delegation seems to believe they can maintain the benefits of galactic civilization without accepting its responsibilities and limitations. We believe we can build something better, Vasquez said simply. The Council was created to coordinate between species that needed each other's cooperation to survive and thrive. But if one species can dominate all the others through control of essential infrastructure, then the Council has failed in its fundamental purpose. Failed how? Vexay asked. The Council has prevented wars, facilitated trade, spread knowledge across dozens of species. By what measure has it failed? By the measure sitting in this room right now, Dr. Chen gestured around the hall. 18 months of negotiations that everyone knows are pointless because one party has already decided what the outcome will be. Dozens of species offering increasingly desperate concessions for the privilege of remaining economically viable. A governing body that can't govern because it has no power to enforce its decisions on anyone strong enough to ignore them. The Council was never intended to have enforcement powers, Takala protested. It was designed to facilitate cooperation through voluntary association. Exactly, General Okafor said. And when voluntary association becomes involuntary subjugation, it's time to reassess the value of the association. The hall fell silent again as the implications sank in. The humans weren't just withdrawing from the negotiations. They were challenging the fundamental premise that had governed galactic politics for centuries. The assumption that cooperation was always preferable to independence, that compromise was always better than confrontation, that staying within the system was the only responsible choice. Finally, Overlord Vexay spoke, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who believed he understood the game better than anyone else at the table. The human delegation's position is philosophically interesting, but philosophy must eventually confront practical reality. Humanity depends on galactic trade networks, communication systems, technological exchange, and security cooperation. These dependencies cannot be wished away through dramatic gestures. No, Vasquez agreed. They have to be replaced through practical alternatives. What alternatives? The Overlord's skin showed just a hint of darker coloration. Humanity has been a spacefaring species for barely 3 centuries. You lack the resources, the technology, and the infrastructure to maintain your current standard of living without Council support. Dr. Chen activated his portable display, projecting a 3-dimensional map of known space that showed human colonies, trade routes, and resource flows. Actually, our analysis suggests otherwise. Humanity's colonies are distributed across 17 different sectors, most of them outside traditional hyperspace lanes. Our economic model is already more decentralized than most Council species because we've been settling worlds that others considered marginal or inaccessible. Marginal worlds with marginal resources, Bexhay observed dismissively. Marginal worlds with untapped resources, Chen corrected. We've focused on terraforming and development projects that don't require the intensive support networks that established species depend on. It's made us less immediately prosperous than we might have been, but it's also made us less dependent on systems we don't control. The display shifted to show technological development patterns, with human innovations highlighted in blue against a background of interspecies technology sharing. As for technology, humanity has actually been a net contributor to Council knowledge bases for the past 50 years. We've shared more innovations than we've adopted, particularly in the areas of adaptive terraforming, quantum navigation, and defensive systems. Defensive systems that were developed in cooperation with Council research programs, Vexai pointed out. Defensive systems that we developed and shared with Council research programs, General Okafor corrected. The gravitational displacement fields that protect most Council worlds were originally human innovations. The quantum communication networks that allow real-time coordination across galactic distances, also human innovations. We've been generous with our technology because we believed in the value of cooperation. But generosity requires reciprocity. And do you believe the Council has not been reciprocal? Takala asked. I believe the Council has become a mechanism for powerful species to legitimize their control over weaker ones, Vasquez replied. The hegemony didn't develop those hyperspace lanes. They conquered the species that did develop them, then claimed historical rights to the conquest. The Council's response is to negotiate the terms of their control rather than question the legitimacy of the control itself. Overlord Vexai's expression had shifted subtly, taking on the focused intensity of someone who had just realized they might be facing a more serious challenge than anticipated. The human delegation seems to believe they can simply opt out of galactic politics. History suggests that such isolationist strategies ultimately fail. We're not choosing isolationism, Vasquez said. We're choosing independence. There's a difference between withdrawing from galactic civilization and withdrawing from galactic subjugation. An interesting distinction. How exactly does humanity propose to maintain its technological and economic development without access to Council resources? Dr. Chen's display shifted again, showing projected development timelines for human colonies operating under different scenarios. Independent development would actually accelerate our technological progress in several key areas. We've been limiting our research to conform with Council standards and safety protocols. Without those restrictions, we can implement innovations that the Council has deemed potentially destabilizing, such as quantum tunnel navigation that makes traditional hyperspace lanes obsolete, General Okafor said calmly. Distributed energy systems that eliminate dependence on centralized power networks, automated manufacturing that reduces the need for resource-intensive trade relationships, self-sustaining ecosystems that make colonial worlds independent of food imports. The silence that followed was different from the previous quiet moments in the hall. This wasn't the silence of shock or confusion. This was the silence of serious people realizing that their assumptions about power relationships might be wrong. Finally, Ambassador Takala spoke, her voice carefully controlled. The human delegation is suggesting that independence from the Council would actually be advantageous for humanity's development. We're suggesting that dependence has been limiting our development, Chen replied. The Council's approach to progress is consensus-based, which means every innovation has to be acceptable to every member species. It's a naturally conservative approach that favors incremental improvements over breakthrough developments. Conservative approaches prevent disasters, Vexai observed. They also prevent progress, Vasquez replied. The hegemony's current strategy is a perfect example of Council conservatism. Rather than challenging your historical claims or developing alternative infrastructure, the Council is trying to find ways to accommodate your demands. It's a conservative approach that preserves short-term stability at the cost of long-term freedom. Freedom is a luxury that requires security, the Overlord said. Independent species are vulnerable species. The galaxy contains threats that no single civilization can handle alone. Does it? General Okafor asked. Or does the galaxy contain threats that the Council has chosen not to handle effectively? Piracy rates in Council-patrolled space are actually higher than in many independent sectors. Conflict resolution through Council mechanisms takes an average of 7 years and frequently results in outcomes that satisfy no one. Even basic trade disputes, like this one, can drag on indefinitely without resolution. Because effective conflict resolution requires compromise from all parties, Takala protested. No, Vasquez said quietly. Effective conflict resolution requires consequences for unreasonable behavior. The Council has no meaningful consequences to offer. Species that want to cooperate are bound by Council decisions. Species that want to dominate simply ignore Council decisions and do whatever they want anyway. You're describing anarchy, Vexai said, though his skin was now showing definite patterns of darker coloration. I'm describing freedom, Vexai replied. The freedom to make your own choices and face your own consequences. The freedom to succeed or fail based on your own decisions rather than someone else's tolerance for your existence. Chen had been running additional calculations during the exchange, and now he looked up from his displays with an expression of surprised satisfaction. Actually, the numbers support withdrawal even more strongly than I initially projected. If we implement quantum tunnel technology and offer passage to other species on reasonable terms, we could see a 300% increase in intersystem trade within 5 years. We wouldn't just be maintaining our current economic position, we'd be dramatically improving it, while undermining the entire structure of galactic commerce, Vexai observed, his voice carrying an undertone that might have been intended as threatening. While offering galactic commerce an alternative to subjugation, General Okafor corrected. Other species would be free to choose between paying tribute to the hegemony for passage through traditional lanes or trading with humanity through quantum tunnel routes. Competition tends to produce better outcomes than monopoly. The implications were sinking in across the hall, and the various alien delegations were beginning to show signs of genuine excitement. For 18 months, they had been trapped in negotiations where every option led to some form of submission to hegemony control. Suddenly, the humans were describing a scenario where that might not be the only choice available. Ambassador Takala's wings had begun fluttering in patterns that indicated rapid mental calculation. If humanity could provide alternative trade routes that bypassed hegemony-controlled lanes entirely, the economic pressure that makes their demands effective would be significantly reduced. Exactly, Chen agreed. The hegemony strategy only works if everyone believes they have no choice but to accept it. Once viable alternatives exist, the negotiating dynamic changes completely. Theoretical alternatives, Vexay said firmly. Quantum tunnel technology remains unproven at the scales required for commercial application. The human delegation is proposing to bet their civilization's future on untested theoretical physics. Theoretical physics that we've been developing for the past decade, Vasquez replied. We've run successful tests on routes up to 15 light-years. Scaling up to commercial applications is an engineering challenge, not a theoretical breakthrough. Engineering challenges have destroyed civilizations before, the Overlord observed. So has political subjugation, General Okafor said dryly. At least engineering challenges offer the possibility of success. The hall was buzzing now with quiet conversations as various species delegations discussed the implications among themselves. The humans had done more than announce their withdrawal. They had offered a vision of what galactic politics might look like without the Council's framework of managed interdependence. Overlord Vexusai stood slowly, his imposing height and dark skin coloration commanding attention throughout the hall. When he spoke, his voice carried the formal tones reserved for official pronouncements. The hegemony notes the human delegation's decision to withdraw from Council membership. Such withdrawals are, of course, permitted under Council Charter provisions. However, the hegemony also notes that withdrawal from the Council necessarily implies withdrawal from Council protection and Council-mediated agreements. Species that choose independence must be prepared to face the consequences of that independence without relying on Council intervention. It was as close to a direct threat as diplomatic protocols allowed. Vasquez felt something cold settle in her stomach as the full implications of their decision became clear. The hegemony wasn't just warning about economic consequences. They were suggesting that human independence might face active opposition. But as she looked around the hall, she realized that the threat had backfired. The other species delegations weren't looking intimidated. They were looking angry. For 18 months they had accepted the fiction that these were negotiations between equals. Vexay's barely concealed threat had stripped away that fiction and revealed the reality underneath. The human delegation appreciates the Overlord's clarification, Vasquez replied with deliberate calm. It confirms our assessment that Council membership has become incompatible with genuine independence. We accept full responsibility for the consequences of our choices, and we look forward to demonstrating that independence remains a viable option in galactic politics. Independence built on unproven technology and unsupported by established trade relationships. Vexay said. The hegemony wishes humanity success in their experiment, though we remain skeptical about its prospects. Escapism is reasonable, General Okafor agreed. But skepticism works both ways. We're skeptical about the prospects for a galactic civilization built on tribute and subjugation. History suggests that such systems eventually collapse under their own contradictions. History suggests that species which overestimate their capabilities face harsh corrections, the Overlord replied. The exchange was approaching the edge of diplomatic courtesy, and everyone in the hall could feel the tension building. Ambassador Takala fluttered her wings in the pattern that requested permission to speak. Perhaps, she said carefully, this discussion might be more productive if we focused on practical arrangements for the transition period. If humanity is determined to withdraw from the Council, there are numerous agreements and cooperative projects that will require adjustment. It was a tactful way of acknowledging that the decision had been made while moving the conversation away from threats and ultimatums. Dr. Chen consulted his displays and nodded. We're prepared to honor all existing agreements through their scheduled completion dates, he said. For ongoing projects, we're willing to discuss transition arrangements that minimize disruption to our partners. The goal is orderly withdrawal, not precipitous abandonment of our obligations. How generous! Vexay's tone was carefully neutral, but his skin remained dark. And what of human colonies in sectors currently protected by Council defense agreements? Human colonies have always been primarily responsible for their own defense, General Okafor replied. Council defense agreements provide supplementary support, not primary protection. Our colonial defense capabilities are more than adequate for the threats we're likely to face. Threats have a way of escalating when species choose to operate outside established security frameworks, the Overlord observed. Yes, Vasquez said quietly. They do. Which is why we've spent the past decade developing defensive capabilities that don't rely on anyone else's permission or cooperation. Independence requires self-reliance, and we've prepared accordingly. The conversation continued for another hour, working through the practical details of withdrawal from dozens of Council programs and agreements. Throughout it all, the fundamental tension remained. The hegemony clearly expected human independence to fail, either through internal collapse or external pressure, while the humans projected confidence in their ability to succeed outside Council structures. What became increasingly clear as the session progressed was that the other species in the hall were watching this exchange with fascination rather than horror. The humans weren't just withdrawing from an impossible situation. They were demonstrating that withdrawal was possible. For species that had spent months contemplating economic subjugation as their only option, the mere existence of an alternative was revolutionary. When the session finally ended, the human delegation gathered their materials with the calm efficiency that had characterized their participation throughout the negotiations. As they prepared to leave, Ambassador Takala approached them, her wings held in the formal posture that indicated serious intent. Ambassador Vasquez, she said quietly. The Zephyrian Confederacy would be interested in discussing the possibility of alternative trade arrangements should your quantum tunnel project prove successful. Similar conversations were starting throughout the hall as other species delegations realized that they might not have to choose between Council membership and economic survival. The humans had opened a door that everyone had assumed was permanently closed. As they walked through the corridors of the diplomatic station toward their shuttle bay, General Okafor shook her head in amazement. 18 months of negotiations and all we had to do was walk away. Walking away was the easy part, Dr. Chen observed. Now we have to prove that we can make independence work. We will, Vasquez said with quiet certainty. Humans have been proving that for our entire history. Every time we've been told that something was impossible, that we had to accept limitations that others imposed on us, that we had to be satisfied with what we were given instead of reaching for what we wanted, we've found a way to prove the conventional wisdom wrong. As their shuttle cleared the station's docking bay and turned toward human space, Ambassador Vasquez looked back at the massive structure that had housed galactic diplomacy for 3 centuries. In a few years, it might be empty, its purpose made obsolete by species that had rediscovered the courage to choose independence over security. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Humanity was about to test that ancient wisdom on a galactic scale. Part 2. The Empty Halls. The Galactic Diplomatic Station had never been designed for silence. Its massive halls and conference chambers were built to accommodate the constant flow of interspecies negotiations, trade discussions, and cultural exchanges that had defined galactic civilization for centuries. The acoustic systems were calibrated for the cacophony of dozens of different species speaking in their native languages, while translators worked to bridge the gaps between radically different forms of communication. Now, 6 months after the human withdrawal, the station felt hollow in ways that had nothing to do with occupancy levels. Ambassador Takala of the Zephyrian Confederacy walked through corridors that had once bustled with activity, her footsteps echoing in spaces that seemed too large for the diminished number of delegates who still maintained permanent offices here. Her translucent wings caught the artificial light in patterns that would have conveyed deep melancholy to any other Zephyrian, but there were precious few of her people left on the station to read such signals. The human withdrawal had triggered a cascade of changes that no one had quite anticipated. It wasn't that other species had immediately followed humanity's lead. Formal withdrawal from the Galactic Council remained an extreme step that most governments were unwilling to take. Instead, what had happened was more subtle and perhaps more damaging to the Council's authority. Species had simply stopped showing up. Not officially, of course. The various delegations maintained their diplomatic credentials and continued to file the appropriate paperwork with Council administration. But the crucial negotiations, the binding agreements, the day-to-day business of galactic governance, those activities were increasingly taking place elsewhere. Takala paused outside what had once been the human delegation's permanent conference room. The space had been reassigned to General Council use, but it remained empty most days. Through the transparent aluminum walls, she could see the carefully arranged furniture, the dormant communication systems, the blank display screens that had once shown the intricate economic models Dr. Chen had used to analyze every proposal and counter-proposal. The humans had been methodical in their departure. They had honored every agreement, completed every project, and transferred every responsibility with a kind of professional competence that made their absence even more noticeable. There had been no dramatic scenes, no angry speeches, no burned bridges. They had simply finished their work and left, as if withdrawing from galactic civilization was just another administrative task to be handled efficiently. "Ambassador Takala!" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Earthshaker Throm approaching, his massive form moving with the careful precision that Krulon used in environments not designed for their bulk. "I was hoping to speak with you regarding the mineral rights negotiations." "Of course," Takala replied, though privately she wondered if there was any point to continuing those particular discussions. The mineral rights in question involved asteroids and systems that could only be accessed efficiently through routes that either passed through hegemony-controlled space or required the kind of quantum tunnel technology that only humans had successfully implemented. They walked together toward one of the smaller conference rooms, passing through sections of the station that would normally have been crowded with delegations from dozens of species. Today they encountered perhaps a dozen individuals in corridors designed to accommodate hundreds. "The Krulon Collective has been reconsidering our position on the Tau Ceti arrangements," Throm said, as they settled into chairs that had been specially reinforced to handle his species' weight requirements. "Recent developments have suggested that our original assumptions about transportation costs may no longer be valid." Takala understood perfectly. Like most council species, the Krulon had structured their economic planning around the assumption that galactic trade would continue to flow through hegemony-controlled hyperspace lanes at whatever rates the Dominari chose to charge. The quantum tunnel network that humanity had been developing changed those calculations completely. "Have you received any communication from the human colonies regarding access to their alternative routes?" she asked. "Informal discussions only," Throm replied carefully. The humans seemed to be prioritizing the completion of their network infrastructure before making formal trade agreements. However, The preliminary cost projections they've shared are significantly more favorable than hegemony toll schedules. That was diplomatically phrased understatement. The routing costs that human representatives had discussed in unofficial conversations were roughly 1/10 of what the hegemony had been demanding. Even accounting for the risks of dealing with untested technology, the economic advantages were overwhelming. The Zephyrian Confederacy has been considering similar alternatives, Takala admitted. Our mining operations in the outer systems are simply not viable under current transportation cost structures. If the human quantum tunnel network proves reliable, it would change everything, Throm finished. The question is whether we can afford to wait for proof of reliability, or whether the current situation is deteriorating too rapidly for patience. Through the conference room's windows, they could see one of the station's main transit hubs. Normally, it would have been busy with shuttles carrying delegations to and from various negotiations. Today, the docking bays stood mostly empty, their automated systems cycling through standby routines while waiting for traffic that might not come. Have you spoken with any of the other delegations about coordinated responses to the transportation issue? Takala asked. Throm's expression, as much as his rocky features could convey expression, suggested careful consideration. The Ethereal Collective has been exploring alternative arrangements. The Salanthi Trade Union has suspended several major projects pending resolution of the current crisis. Even the hegemony's traditional allies seem to be reconsidering their positions. The current crisis was diplomatic language for the fact that galactic commerce was grinding toward a halt. The hegemony had implemented their toll system on schedule, exactly as they had threatened to do throughout the failed negotiations. The rates were precisely what they had demanded. Economically devastating for most species, but technically sustainable for short periods. The problem was that technically sustainable had turned out to be very different from practically workable. Species that could theoretically afford the new toll rates found themselves unable to justify the costs for anything but emergency shipments. Trade routes that had operated profitably for centuries were being abandoned. Colonies that depended on regular supply deliveries were facing shortages of everything from medical supplies to basic manufactured goods. How long can the Krulon Collective maintain current operations under these conditions? Takala asked directly. 6 months, perhaps 8, if we implement severe rationing protocols, Throm replied without hesitation. Under normal circumstances, that distribution provides security and efficiency. Under current transportation costs, it's become a catastrophic liability. Takala's wings fluttered involuntarily. The Krulon were among the most economically stable species in the galaxy, their resource extraction and processing capabilities essential to dozens of other civilizations. If they were facing collapse within months, smaller species were likely measuring their survival in weeks. The humans knew, she said quietly. When they withdrew from the negotiations, they knew this would happen. They tried to tell us it would happen, Throm corrected. Dr. Chen's economic projections were quite explicit about the unsustainability of the hegemony's demands. We chose not to believe him because the alternative seemed worse. The alternative seemed worse because we couldn't imagine any other option, Takala realized. We were so focused on maintaining council membership and council protection that we never seriously considered whether those things were actually protecting us. Through the conference room's communication system, they could hear the distant sounds of the station's daily operations. Maintenance crews moving through the corridors, automated systems running their diagnostic cycles, the occasional announcement about scheduled shuttle arrivals. But underneath those routine sounds was something that had never existed before in the station's 3-century history. Emptiness, the absence of the constant background noise of busy civilization. I received a communication from the Zephyrian home system yesterday, Takala said after a long pause. Our government has authorized me to begin formal discussions with any available alternatives to current trade arrangements. Quite broad in scope. Throm's attention focused on her with the intensity that Krulon reserved for truly significant information. Broad enough to include arrangements with non-council entities? Broad enough to include whatever arrangements might preserve our civilization, she replied bluntly. The implications hung between them like a challenge to everything they had believed about galactic politics. For centuries, council membership had been the foundation of interstellar civilization. The idea that species might not only survive but thrive outside council structures had been almost unthinkable. Almost. The human quantum tunnel test flights had been remarkably successful, Throm said carefully. Their published data suggests journey times 40% faster than traditional hyperspace routes, with significantly lower energy costs and infrastructure requirements. Published data that anyone can access, Takala observed. They're not treating their innovations as proprietary secrets, because they don't need to. Drom's massive fingers drummed against the conference table in patterns that indicated deep thought among his species. The humans have achieved something that the Council never managed. They've made independence more attractive than dependence. Takala considered that statement while watching the empty transit hub beyond the windows. Independence more attractive than dependence. It seemed like such an obvious goal, yet somehow galactic civilization had evolved in the opposite direction. The Council had become a system where the strongest members used collective resources to maintain their advantages, while weaker members accepted diminished autonomy in exchange for protection and access. "Have you considered," she said slowly, "that the Council may have outlived its usefulness?" "The thought has occurred to me," Throm admitted. "The Council was created to facilitate cooperation between species that needed each other's assistance to survive and develop. But what happens when some species no longer need that assistance? When the cooperation becomes one-sided, when the strong use Council mechanisms to dominate the weak rather than help them, then the Council becomes an obstacle to progress rather than a facilitator of it," Takala finished, which explains why the most innovative species in recent galactic history just walked away from it. They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, each considering the implications of their conversation. Finally, Takala activated her personal communication system and began composing a message to the Zephyrian government. The text was brief and carefully worded, but its meaning was clear. Authorization was requested to begin formal discussions with human representatives regarding alternative trade arrangements. "What are you planning?" Throm asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "I'm planning to do what the humans did," she replied. "I'm planning to put my species' survival ahead of political convention." Within hours of sending her message, Takala received responses that were both predictable and surprising. Predictable in that her government granted the requested authorization immediately and with enthusiasm. Surprising in that she also received messages from 7 other Council species requesting information about any alternative arrangements she might discover. The requests came through unofficial channels, carefully worded to avoid any appearance of coordinated action against Council interests. But the pattern was clear. Species across the galaxy were quietly preparing to abandon the system that had governed galactic politics for centuries. 2 days later, Takala stood in the station's main shuttle bay, preparing to depart for the human colony world of New Geneva. The journey would take her through space that technically remained under Council jurisdiction, but practically operated according to whatever local arrangements various species could negotiate among themselves. As her shuttle cleared the station's docking pylons, she looked back at the massive structure that had been the center of galactic civilization for as long as anyone could remember. From this distance, it looked smaller somehow, less imposing than it had seemed when she first arrived as a junior diplomatic attaché decades ago. The human withdrawal had lasted exactly 6 months, and in that time they had accomplished more than the Council had managed in 6 years. Their quantum tunnel network now connected 43 human colonies across 17 sectors. Trade flowing through human-controlled routes had increased by 800%, while commerce through traditional Council-managed channels had dropped by 60%. More importantly, the humans had demonstrated that it was possible to operate outside Council structures, not just temporarily, but permanently. Their colonies weren't struggling isolated outposts clinging to survival. They were thriving communities that attracted immigrants from other species, seeking opportunities that the Council-dominated economy could no longer provide. The shuttle's navigation system chimed softly, indicating they had passed beyond the diplomatic station's immediate control zone. Ahead lay human space, where species chose their own trade partners and negotiated their own agreements without requiring Council approval or hegemony permission. Behind lay the hollow halls of a dying institution, where fewer species sent delegations each month to participate in negotiations that increasingly had no practical relevance to galactic civilization. Part 3. The New Foundations. The conference room on New Geneva looked nothing like the grand halls of the Galactic Diplomatic Station. It was smaller, more utilitarian, with transparent aluminum windows that offered a view of the terraformed landscape rather than starfields. The furniture was comfortable but unremarkable, and the communication systems were efficient rather than impressive. Everything about the space conveyed a simple message. This was a place for getting work done, not for making grand gestures. Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat at one end of an oval table, reviewing reports from human colonies across 17 sectors. 6 months of independence had brought challenges that even the most optimistic projections hadn't fully anticipated, but they had also brought opportunities that exceeded their most ambitious hopes. The quantum tunnel network was operating at 112% of projected capacity, carrying trade traffic that had grown exponentially as more species discovered the advantages of bypassing hegemony-controlled routes. Human colonies that had been economically marginal under council trade regulations were now prospering as crucial links in the new transportation infrastructure. More significantly, the network was carrying more than just human trade. Ambassador Takala's shuttle had been only the first of many diplomatic missions from species seeking alternatives to council-mediated relationships. What had started as economic necessity was evolving into something that looked increasingly like a new form of galactic civilization. Dr. Chen entered the conference room carrying data tablets and wearing the expression of someone who had been working with numbers that defied easy categorization. "The latest traffic reports," he said, settling into his chair and activating holographic displays that showed three-dimensional maps of trade flows across human space. "How does it look?" General Okafor asked as she joined them, fresh from inspecting the orbital defense platforms that had been constructed around New Geneva in the months since withdrawal. "Unprecedented," Chen replied, highlighting specific routes on his display. "We're handling trade traffic from 47 different species, most of them non-council entities that we've never had direct relationships with before. The Silanthi Trade Union alone is routing 60% of their intersector commerce through our network." "And the hegemony's response?" Vasquez asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Increasingly desperate," General Okafor said grimly. "Our intelligence suggests they've lost approximately 70% of their toll revenue in the past 4 months. Their attempts to pressure traditional allies into boycotting human routes have been mostly unsuccessful, because the economic advantages are too obvious to ignore." Chen's displays showed the stark reality of the new galactic economy. Traditional hyperspace lanes that had carried the majority of intersystem trade for centuries now handled less than 30% of total traffic. The quantum tunnel routes that humans had pioneered were faster, cheaper, and more reliable than the systems they were replacing. "The question," Vasquez observed, "is how long the hegemony will tolerate this situation before they decide that economic pressure isn't sufficient. Our defensive preparations assume they'll try direct action within the next 6 months." Okafor replied. "The orbital platforms around our major colonies can handle anything short of a full-scale invasion fleet, and our early warning systems would give us at least 72 hours notice of any major fleet movements." "Military solutions might not be their preferred option," Chen interjected. "The hegemony's strength has always been their ability to control galactic politics through economic leverage and council manipulation. Direct military action against a former council species would essentially admit that their traditional methods have failed." Vasquez considered the implications while studying the trade flow data. The humans hadn't set out to destroy the existing galactic order. They had simply refused to accept a role as tributary subjects within it. But their success in building alternatives had created consequences that no one had fully anticipated. "What about the council itself?" she asked. "Any changes in their operational status?" "Significant changes." Chen consulted additional displays showing political and economic data from across council space. Attendance at council sessions has dropped to less than 50% of normal levels. Several major species have suspended their participation in council programs while they reassess their commitments. Even species that remain technically loyal to council structures are increasingly conducting their important business through bilateral relationships that bypass council oversight entirely. "The Galactic Diplomatic Station is operating at about 30% capacity," Okafor added. "Most of the ongoing activities are ceremonial rather than substantive. The Council still exists as a legal entity, but it's becoming irrelevant to the actual conduct of galactic civilization." A soft chime indicated that their scheduled meeting was about to begin. Vasquez activated the communication systems as representatives from 6 different species appeared on holographic displays around the table. These were the species that had formally requested inclusion in what was being called the Human Trade Network, though everyone understood that it was evolving into something more comprehensive than simple commercial relationships. Ambassador Takala appeared in the central display, her image transmitted from the Zephyrian flagship that had arrived in the New Geneva system the previous day. Around her were representatives of the Krulon Collective, the Silanthi Trade Union, the Ethereal Collective, and 3 smaller species that had never achieved major influence within council structures. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Vasquez began. As we discussed in our preliminary conversations, the success of the quantum tunnel network has created opportunities that extend far beyond simple trade relationships. We're essentially building the infrastructure for a new form of galactic civilization. And it seems appropriate to discuss how that civilization might be governed. Governed by whom? Asked Earthshaker Throme, his massive form filling most of his display area. The Krulon Collective appreciates the opportunities that human innovation has provided, but we have no interest in replacing council dominance with human dominance. Neither do we, Vasquez replied immediately. Human independence was never about controlling other species. It was about refusing to be controlled by other species. We have no desire to recreate the problems that made council membership untenable. Then what exactly are you proposing? Takala's wings fluttered in patterns that conveyed cautious interest. Chen activated displays that showed organizational charts and governance structures. We're proposing a confederation of independent species, each maintaining complete autonomy over their internal affairs while cooperating on matters of mutual interest. No central authority, no mandatory compliance with collective decisions, no mechanisms for one species to impose its will on another. Anarchy, observed the Ethereal Collective's representative, their energy form flickering with what might have been amusement. Voluntary association, General Akafor corrected. Species choose their own level of participation based on their own interests and capabilities. No one is required to join, no one is prevented from leaving, and no one can use collective mechanisms to dominate anyone else. The Salanthi Trade Union representative, a being whose crystalline structure refracted light in complex patterns, posed the obvious question, how would such an organization handle disputes between member species? How would collective security be maintained without central authority? The same way humans handled those issues for most of our history, Vasquez replied. Through bilateral negotiations, mutual defense agreements, economic relationships based on reciprocal benefit rather than enforced compliance. The galaxy operated without central authority for millions of years before the Council was created. There's no reason it can't operate that way again. Except that the galaxy has become much more complex, Takala pointed out. Modern interstellar civilization involves technological exchanges, resource flows, and communication networks that require coordination across dozens of star systems. The Council was created precisely because voluntary cooperation proved insufficient for managing that complexity. The Council was created because voluntary cooperation was insufficient for the species that existed at the time, Chen corrected. But technological development has changed the fundamental parameters of the problem. Quantum tunnel networks eliminate most transportation bottlenecks. Automated manufacturing reduces resource dependencies. Advanced communication systems make real-time coordination possible across galactic distances. He activated additional displays showing economic and technological projections. The infrastructure that makes modern civilization possible no longer requires centralized management. In fact, centralized management has become a barrier to optimal utilization of that infrastructure. The discussion continued for over 2 hours as representatives explored the practical implications of confederation versus centralized governance. The humans had clearly thought through many of the challenges, but they had also been careful to avoid presenting their solutions as final answers rather than starting points for negotiation. What emerged from the conversation was a framework that was both simpler and more sophisticated than traditional galactic governance structures. Simpler because it eliminated the complex hierarchies and mandatory compliance mechanisms that had characterized council operations. More sophisticated because it assumed that mature civilizations could cooperate effectively without being forced to cooperate. The essential principle Vasquez summarized near the end of the meeting is that no species should be required to accept limitations on their own development in order to accommodate another species' preferences. Cooperation should enhance independence, not replace it. And when species' interests conflict directly? The Ethereal Collective asked. Then they negotiate solutions or they don't cooperate in those specific areas, General Okafor replied. Conflict between independent parties is resolved through bargaining, compromise, or mutual avoidance. It's only when one party can impose costs on the other without consequences that conflicts become intractable. After the meeting ended and the various representatives had signed off to consult with their governments, the 3 humans remained in the conference room, reviewing what they had accomplished and what challenges remained ahead.
They'll agree to it.
Chen predicted with confidence. The economic advantages are too obvious and the political advantages are too significant. Independence is more attractive than subjugation for every species in that discussion. The question is whether we can make it work in practice, Okafor said. Voluntary cooperation sounds wonderful in theory, but it requires a level of mutual respect and self-restraint that hasn't always characterized galactic politics. It requires consequences for violations of that mutual respect, Vasquez corrected. The problem with council structures was that species could violate cooperative agreements without facing meaningful costs as long as they were powerful enough to ignore council displeasure. In a confederation of independent species, violations of cooperative agreements result in immediate exclusion from cooperative benefits. Chen was running projections on his displays, modeling various scenarios for Confederation growth and development. The mathematics actually support optimism, he announced. Voluntary cooperation tends to be more stable than forced cooperation because participants have constant opportunities to evaluate whether continued participation serves their interests. Species that benefit from cooperation have strong incentives to maintain it. Species that don't benefit have the option to leave without destabilizing the entire system. 3 weeks later, the new Geneva Accords were signed by representatives of 12 species, establishing the first formal alternative to council governance in galactic history. The document was remarkably brief, only 40 pages compared to the thousands of pages of regulations that governed council operations, but its brevity reflected philosophical clarity rather than inadequate consideration of complex issues. The Confederation of Independent Systems, as it came to be known, operated on principles that were both ancient and revolutionary in the galactic context. Ancient because they drew on human experiences with voluntary association and limited government that dated back thousands of years. Revolutionary because they assumed that intelligent species could govern themselves without requiring supervision from superior authorities. 6 months after the new Geneva Accords, the Confederation included 28 member species and operated the most extensive trade network in galactic history. Quantum tunnel routes connected over 200 star systems, carrying commerce that had grown to exceed the peak volumes that had flowed through council-managed infrastructure. More importantly, the Confederation had demonstrated that galactic civilization could function without the hegemony's essential transportation infrastructure and without the Council's necessary governance frameworks. Species that had spent generations accepting limited autonomy in exchange for protection and access were discovering that unlimited autonomy